What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. It is my absolute pleasure today to be joined by Brian Miner. Brian, how are you doing?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Making the best of things.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you give our listeners a little bit of a background about yourself before we get into our discussion topics for today?
Yeah, so I'm a coach, and I've been coaching since 2012, and full time since 2015. Have my master's in health and exercise science, and I compete as a natural bodybuilder and raw powerlifter, USAPL. Haven't competed since 2017, but hoping to do a meet either late this year or early next year. But yeah, first and foremost, I'm a coach, and I'm interested in the evidence-based side of things, and looking at things, I guess, with a critical eye, and trying to take a fairly holistic approach to how I coach and program. But yeah.
So yeah, you definitely have a great background as far as academically, and combining that with your experience in the sport. Very successful as both a powerlifter, bodybuilder. And yes, I totally agree. You do tend to have a critical eye when it comes to these sorts of things, which is why I'm really excited for our discussion today, and especially the specific topics we'll be diving into. So to kind of just set the framework for this discussion, it's basically going to be a conversation about periodization and programming strategies specifically for hypertrophy training. So this becomes pretty interesting because I have a background in powerlifting, you're a powerlifter. When it comes to periodization for powerlifting, it seems pretty clear there are some big rocks you want to focus on. We're going to start out with some higher volume work. Volume is going to decrease over time. Intensity is going to increase. Classic linear periodization. We're going to string a couple of blocks together, probably utilize some sort of daily undulating programming within that. And that kind of in the evidence-based circle, everyone's kind of in agreement. Like, that's kind of the general way you structure powerlifting training. And, when it comes to measuring powerlifting specific performance, we know that periodization tends to outperform non-periodized models. But when it comes to hypertrophy, like when we look at the most recent review from Gurgic and Schoenfeld, there looks like there's not really a benefit to periodization for hypertrophy. But we kind of have to consider the limitations of periodization for hypertrophy in that these models come from sports performance. We're measuring something very specific in regards to 1RM strength or power, whereas hypertrophy is kind of it's a forgiving adaptation, right? We don't need to be our most jacked on this specific day or anything like that. And then also with these models, they're primarily catered towards performance, and then also they're short-term in nature, and hypertrophy is a very slow process. So with all that kind of being said, we kind of want to dive into some theories about perhaps the best way to plan hypertrophy training in order to maximize our outcomes. So right now in the community, when it comes to unique strategies to program hypertrophy training, everyone's kind of on this wagon, started at Renaissance periodization and Mike Israetel's concepts about increasing volumes through sets by week to week over the course of a mesocycle. So, Brian, can you kind of touch on the potential positives and negatives of this strategy for us?
Yeah, so, just to kind of go back just to what you said about, periodization for hypertrophy. There's not a lot of evidence showing that it's more beneficial. But I guess just to sort of steer the direction that I think a lot of my ideas are going to go here, I think ultimately, just because something isn't proven to be beneficial yet. I think there's a lot of practical use and utility in it for reasons that could extend outside of, optimizing like the physiology of it. I think, just from a practical standpoint and enjoyment standpoint, from a joint integrity management standpoint, I think there's that can be reason enough to include some type of variable manipulation. So with that being said, the model of increasing set volume, I think is a really interesting discussion, because we know that volume is highly correlated with hypertrophy, and the idea being that should be the key driver in progression across a mesocycle. I think Dr. Mike and his co-authors they wrote a paper for Strength and Conditioning Journal on mesocycle progression for hypertrophy. And they discussed, the literature looking at the correlation between volume and hypertrophy, as well as the literature showing equivalent hypertrophy with different absolute intensities. So different rep ranges, the load is somewhat, to a point, irrelevant so long as the sets are taken close enough to failure. So the argument would then be, there's evidence for, volume being highly associated, whereas, load is not. And that's sort of the basis for the discussion of progressing volume is a priority. So I think it's reasonable on the surface. I think there's definitely, it definitely works. And I think these discussions are largely theoretical in nature, because it's impossible for us to know right now whether or not that's optimal. And I believe him and Brad Schoenfeld, if I'm not mistaken, are working on collaborating on a study to more directly examine this. And so I'm really interested to see that. And I'm by no means married to my ideas, but I think there are some potential criticisms of that model. And I think that the biggest one for me is it's sort of the assumption that you need to progress something proactively from one week to the next. And if we talk about the concept of volume landmarks, and there being a minimum effective dose, then a maximum recoverable dose, and then the maximum adaptive volume, that what we can just consider optimal volume, somewhere in between in most cases. So the idea and premise of this, based on my understanding, is MEV is increasing across the block. Therefore, with that threshold increasing across the block, you need to be able to stay above that. And so increasing set volume is going to allow you to stay ahead of MEV, essentially. And I just don't think there's, to my knowledge, there's evidence that indicates that MEV increases at that rate, like on a weekly basis. So, and if there was, I guess people wouldn't make any progress, with a static model to begin with. They would, if you have like a 5-week block and you keep set volume relatively the same. So I guess I'll compare two examples, like going from 10 sets to 20 sets per body part per week, which I believe is the example they provide in their paper, which I know this isn't the case. This is just an example that they gave. It's not like this is the, all of they're saying, go from 10 to 20, because it's a pretty assertive increase in volume. But, I think a case could certainly be made to go more in the middle ground, and, compare 15 sets across each of those weeks, or have a static set volume, and then manage the volume based off of your performance. And that's when it gets a little bit tricky, because I mean, if you're progressing off of static set volume and you're 4 weeks into the block and you're still getting additional reps, with the same relative effort, like that's an indication something is working. Like you're presenting a stimulus that's sufficient enough to spur an adaptation, all else equal. So, and that's in the face of accumulating fatigue. So, you have preparedness, in theory, decreasing gradually across a block, assuming you eventually deload, but you still see this increase in performance. So, it could be indirectly interpreted as, that overload having been occurring the entire time. And so that's my position is, simply taking a more conservative approach. And what we know about, the inverted U relationship with volume and hypertrophy, since there's not really any direct evidence that MEV increases, at the rate that would justify an increase in sets, then it could be, like, I think the argument could be made that it's in fact suboptimal, because you could be starting below what is optimal and then ending above what is optimal in this way. If MEV and ME, or if relatively similar space. So if optimal volume doesn't see a huge shift, you could be spending half of your block, doing less than what's optimal, and half of your block doing more than what's optimal. And so I think the whole model sort of hinges on the idea that that increase in set volume is required to keep in that optimal range. And I just don't think there's any evidence that we have yet to indicate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic points. And I'm in the same boat. I would love to see some direct comparisons of some training programs, one keeping set volume stagnant and the other increasing over the course of the block, and just seeing the outcomes of that. I kind of want to tie together a couple of the points you made here in my next question. So you mentioned that you're not sure whether you need to increase sets from week 1 to week 2 in order to induce progressive overload, or that, that the adaptations are happening that quickly where you need to immediately increase sets. So with that being said, and the fact that we know that there seems to be a relationship between volume and hypertrophy, what are your thoughts on implementing this sort of structure on a larger scale? So perhaps over the course of a macro cycle, keeping sets stagnant in each mesocycle, but over the course of multiple blocks, increasing sets. So again, just on a larger scale, rather than week to week, we're doing it, month to month.
Yeah, I think that would make more sense. I don't think anybody is in disagreement that, the total stimulus needs to increase over time. Like when you're looking through a wide lens, you see, however we're defining volume, chances are it's going to trend up either significantly or, if we're talking about set volume, I'm not sure it increases even on a block to block rate that quickly. I mean, like I'm looking at what I can progress on now, and it's not really any higher than what I was doing, as a early intermediate in terms of set volume. So, like you add in the element that, and this is a bit of a tangent here, but if you add in the element that it's hard to, you can't really count and compare set volume over time unless you're comparing the same type of exercise, the same proximity to failure. Like there's just a lot of things that can augment how you recover and adapt to a given level of volume. I mean, you could be stopping well short of failure, 5 reps short of failure on every set, and have these, a very high volume tolerance. But, once you go to 2 reps in reserve on average for each set, your volume tolerance is, going to come down. The way you perform an exercise comes down. I think across a training career, people become more proficient in their lifts, and they're able to get more out of each set typically. And so I don't really see set volume trending up substantially over time, but I think if there's an argument that can be made for, proactively adding sets, it would be on a larger scale like this. But even then, I still like to manage volume based off of, outcomes rather than assumptions. And so if I'm progressing well and I'm staying healthy, I'm a big believer in, not changing much, because there's no guarantee. Like we don't know where optimal is at any given point, like we don't know if we're just to the left of the peak of that curve. Like we have a rough, for an individual, you might have a rough idea, the range that you're typically in for your style of training, but there's no guarantee that, adding a set isn't just going to push you a little bit to the right side of that, that curve. And so, given how slow progress really occurs at the advanced level, I think if you're progressing at all in terms of performance and using that as a proxy for, hypertrophy, and I'm talking about, like, if you're looking at, comparing apples to apples, like if you're at, across a block, if you're progressing for one, but then in the next block, like if you were to repeat the same block, for example, in week 2 of the block, are you lifting more weights or heavier loads than you were in week 2 of the prior block? And so I guess I'm just a bigger advocate of keeping things or minimizing moving parts when you have performance already trending in the right direction, because I think it can add some noise into the mix. And it's sort of like once somebody sees progress with a given strategy, they're often hesitant to stray from that, So, there's a lot of people that they start doing this model, they see progress, or they hear, volume is associated with hypertrophy, and they start being more aggressive with volume. And they get results, and they see themselves getting results, but down the road, maybe they get hurt and they're forced to dial back, like on their way back up. And, I know a powerlifter that I think this probably happened to, who was doing, just hammer progress, then got injured, obviously saw his lifts come down, but then on the way back up, he was doing more moderate amounts of volume and saw even better progress. So I think a lot of people are sort of in their mind locked pigeonholed into this high volume mindset, assuming that more is better, when really they could be on the right side of that curve, and dialing back could actually lead to better outcomes. So that's why I like to look at, I guess, just let performance kind of dictate how I manage volume. And over time, like there's I think a time and a place to be more assertive and maybe test if it's going to be, lead to better progress. I think there's research out there that's intriguing, with just how much we can benefit from higher amounts of volume in some cases, but I'm just not I would rather auto-regulate things than have, like, okay, now this block, I'm going to do one more set across the board than the block I did before, even though I ended in a state of progress previously. So I usually only manage volume proactively if there's been a plateau.
Awesome. So a little bit more nuanced aspect of this conversation. I think I've seen Chris Beardsley post about this. So when we're looking at increasing volume on an acute basis as opposed to a long-term strategy to bust through a plateau, is adding a set or two from week to week or even month to month, is this really a sign of progressive overload, or that, positive adaptations are taking place, or are we just spending more time in the gym and that's not necessarily indicative of anything beneficial?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. Is it progressive overload? Not necessarily. I guess, you to look at this from a different perspective or from a different angle is if you're doing a set of 10 with 100 pounds one week at 2 RIR, and then you do a set of 11 with 100 pounds the next week, but it's at 1 RIR, is that like, have you had any positive adaptation there? Like, based off performance alone, no, but you have just worked harder. So there's like there's like the proactive approach, and the way, and I know you want to touch on this later, and I've talked about this quite a bit, but just quickly, overload I consider and conceptualize is the amount of, it's basically achieving a state where you're applying a stimulus sufficient enough to spur subsequent adaptations. And progressive overload is more so like, this is the ability to add weight, with all else equal, the ability to increase performance based off of those adaptations. So you're right, like adding sets, is it achieving overload? Yeah, probably. Like you're probably providing a stimulus sufficient enough to cause adaptation. Is it an indication of progress? Not necessarily. Like, and that kind of goes into the idea of, progression and progress they're not the same thing. Like you can progress or have like a progression scheme that's very structured, and by the end of it, you may not have actually progressed much, because you're not comparing apples to apples. So yeah, I agree. Adding sets, I'm not to say that you haven't had any positive adaptation in the process there, but that in and of itself isn't, it's not an indication of progress. Like I'm not going to say it's not progressive overload, because I'm sure if you've adapted at all and had any positive adaptation, then yeah, in a case, some of that's, accommodating that increase. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of rehash on something you said there, decreasing RIR or increasing RP over the course of the mesocycle as a form of inducing overload, like not necessarily overload, right? Because like, if you're adding 5 pounds from this week to that week, but the RP also went up 1, well, you probably could have also done that last week, right?
Exactly. Like I think there's sort of a way to, one way to think of it is like proactive versus reactive overload. In proactive overload, like it's, there's, anytime we adapt, and like one of the reasons we have to perform and apply a greater stimulus over time has to do with like the size principle. So in motor unit recruitment, so the better you perform, or the higher your capacity for performance, for a given set, the threshold for motor unit recruitment in terms of effort, like you're going to have to do a little bit more in order to reach that same threshold. So let me see if I can explain that better. So as you have positive adaptations occurring, you have like say you're pretend you're using the Beardsley like 5 reps in reserve and above, like the 5 rep cutoff, which I don't think it's a line in the sand, but I think it's conceptually a useful way to think about this. So so if you're if that 5 reps in reserve is where you get maximal motor unit recruitment. If you positively adapt and now you're able, instead of 10 reps, able to do 11, you now need to perform 1 additional rep to keep pace with that threshold, that increasing threshold for maximal motor unit recruitment, and being able to continue to place mechanical tension on high threshold motor units as your performance increases. So you're keeping pace with adaptations, and you can still do that with a proactive approach to overload. It's just, are you adding more than what's required? Likely, but I think that in some cases it can create the illusion that you're making progress when you're not. And I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for that. I think, like, especially with powerlifters, I do think something can be said for having some type of like linear progression in some cases. Like, I have an athlete that I'm working with right now. We're doing pretty much just an auto-regulated approach to his top sets and back off work, and it was just like, in terms of motivation and momentum, we were just kind of hitting a wall, and I think we were entering sessions a little bit, pessimistic at times, like just knowing like, okay, this, like, deadlifts haven't felt great for weeks on end. Hopefully they feel good. And so sometimes it's nice just knowing what you need to do and knowing that it's a little bit more than the last week, and just sort of scaling back and then building back momentum with heavier weight. And I think there's, like, from a psychological perspective, sometimes that proactive approach to load progression can be helpful. And there's tons of ways to manage that while still, like, you could still have that be auto-regulated in nature. Like, you could add load but still have like an RPE threshold that you don't go beyond, so there's a lot of ways to go about it, but yeah.
Excellent. So in this theoretical macrocycle we're kind of developing here to maximize hypertrophic outcomes, it might not exactly be beneficial to be increasing set volume from block to block. Sure, you could use that strategy, but it might not be necessary. As far as planning goes, do you think there's any potential advantage to having a specific block within this macrocycle, which is lower in volume and perhaps looks more similar to like a general strength phase for powerlifting? So potential benefits of this being a resensitization effect to future high volume training. And then also some people may propose that, well, if you spend some time lifting, with lower reps, building more of a strength base, that's going to translate into being stronger in your higher rep work, which will improve your hypertrophy training and outcomes. So can you kind of touch on those points for us?
Yeah. The resensitization aspect, I mean, the literature that's looking at hypertrophy that doesn't show a benefit for periodization, or at least not a clear benefit, I would be surprised if there wasn't some benefit of having a lower volume phase at some point, whether that be a deload or a lower volume strength phase. I mean, there is research that directly, or I guess it's indirect evidence for the concept of like resensitization, and I forget the author's name, to be honest, but they had 2 groups that were training, I believe, for 24 weeks. And the one group trained continuously for 24 weeks. The other group trained 6 weeks, then they had 3 weeks of just complete detraining, and then 6 weeks, 3 weeks of detraining, and then 6 weeks. And what they found was, the groups that detrained, it's like, yeah, they lost some of their gains, but by the end of the 24 weeks, they had caught back up to the group that was training continuously. So it's evidence that there is either a resensitization, or it could be like a concurrent desensitization to volume over time. And I think training 24 straight weeks, I mean, you're going to have fatigue starting to mask your ability to perform, I think, and your ability to, potentially to maintain sufficient overload in some cases. So I think that there's definitely data that study, and I should know the name of the author, but that I think was in untrained athletes as well, and it showed, the 3 weeks of complete detraining, ending up in the same spot. So the thought being, if you were to be able to, get that resensitization effect without detraining, without actually losing ground, could you end up ahead in the long run by maintaining gains in those lower volume phases? I certainly think it's possible. I think, a deload may be the same, may result in the same thing. I don't know if we have enough information to say like you require a full block, of lower volume training to accommodate that effect. But I think as far as like the idea of running a strength phase in order to improve your ability to perform in the higher volume blocks, I think it's sort of, in a sense, it sort of ignores the principle of specificity a little bit. Like if I want to get better at sets of 10, like increasing my 3 rep max probably isn't going to be as effective as increasing my 10 rep max, or just focusing on the rep range that I'm training. Now I think if you look at it from the other end, and I'll actually save this because I know you're wanting to talk about the metabolite phase, but I think the specificity thing is, in this case it sort of applies, but in the other end, like, is there an advantage of the metabolite phases? I think there's an argument for that, in terms of improving like your lower or moderate rep performance. But the other thing I wanted to mention is these resensitization phases in practice, these lower volume strength phases, I think a lot of people, when they program these, their set volume doesn't come down. I think a lot of people will go from, say you're using like an undulation pattern of, 3 by 10, 3 by 8, 3 by 6, just random. And then the lower volume phase, maybe you do, 3 by 7, 3 by 5, 3 by 3. Like your set volume is still similar. And yeah, like once you start dipping below like 5 reps, you're not really equating like a set. Usually like when you use set volume to quantify for hypertrophy, you're talking about like sets of 5 reps and above. But I think for that to really be effective, you would almost need to drop set volume a little bit as well, rather than just look at it as reduced volume for tonnage purposes. And I don't think we know exactly the best, we don't know the best way to resensitize, if that's an effect we're trying to get after. Is it, just doing less total work is going to cause that effect, if it's on, in terms of like an anabolic pathway, resensitizing it, like what the best way to go about doing that would be. If I had to speculate, I would think you would want to, reduce or give, those higher threshold motor units less volume. And so maybe cutting set volume would actually be beneficial in those strength phases, rather than just lowering the number of reps and increasing intensity. So just wanted to kind of throw that out there too. But yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, in regards to the resensitization effects, I don't know the exact author's name to either, but I'm pretty sure it starts with an O, and it's something like Okasarwa or something along those lines.
Actually, I had it because I was looking at it earlier. Yeah, August Sawara from, it was in the European Journal of Applied Physiology. But yeah, that was, I think that when we talk about resensitization, that's kind of the original study that provided clues that this could be, we might be onto something. Now, earlier I talked about kind of the holistic approach to things. And I think, at some point, people are going to probably want a lower volume phase anyway. And so I just find for the majority of people that I work with anyway, like a lot of this stuff just naturally ends up working out this way. Whether it be, vacations or, different life obligations, it's sort of like a involuntary extended deload in some cases, and I think, I know for me personally, that is going to occur at least twice a year, where there's going to be like 3 weeks where things are going to be, inevitably have to dial back probably significantly. So yeah, I think, there's that element. And then also a lot of, powerlifters that are bodybuilders, or bodybuilders that, want to, play powerlifters on the side. I think for them, it's a nice way to focus on, the intensity side of things. So the enjoyment perspective and, training with heavier weights, that affords an opportunity to do that as well. So yeah, like in a holistic sense, I think it makes a lot of sense, from like a anabolic mechanism standpoint. I think there's probably something there. I just don't know if we know yet the best way to leverage that. But it'll be interesting. I'm sure we'll have more information on it in the next couple of years.
For sure. You mentioned that we might not need a whole block of training that looks like this lower volume, slightly higher intensity work, and that a deload could potentially accomplish the same thing here. So before we do transition into the potential benefits of a metabolite focused block, can you just kind of talk about deload specifically for bodybuilding, and where our focus should be? Should we be primarily reducing training volume? Should we be primarily focused on intensity? A little bit of both? What's the best approach here?
Yeah, this is an area, to my knowledge, that we don't really have any research on. Most of the deload research in, the bodybuilders that are using performance as a metric for progress, usually they're the ones that are programming, proactively implementing deloads. Like you go into a normal gym where, people are just chasing a pump every single day. It's like most of them aren't programming active deloads. But for those people that are monitoring performance and seeing, seeing things start to level off, and then, taking a deload at that point, I think a lot of them are sort of, many of them coming from kind of like a strength background, and that's where a lot of this tapering research came from. And even then, like a lot of the strength tapering research came from endurance exercise. And so there was I cannot remember this guy's name, the author's name. Anyway, hold on one second. Tapering. Pritchard, that's who it is. Wrote a review on tapering for strength sports, and basically what they found was common was, a reduction in volume is going to be the primary avenue for reducing, residual fatigue. And so the way I like to think about deloads is the main priority is fatigue reduction, and the secondary priority is, maintaining fitness adaptations, because we know fatigue dissipates faster than fitness. And so, even if you did detrain or your fitness came down a little bit, as long as your fatigue dropped to a greater degree, conceptually you should be better off, afterwards. And so, so I think when it comes to hypertrophy, if we're focused on reducing fatigue to help increase performance heading into the subsequent block, right? So that's one thing, difference between tapering and deloading is, tapering is trying to peak for performance, whereas deloading, it's like, let's reload our resources essentially and be able to have a productive subsequent block of training and, get, minimize aches and pains, get them all fixed up. And I think that's usually going to be accomplished primarily with a reduction in volume. With strength sports, with the differences in how I program deloads for like a strength athlete versus a hypertrophy athlete is if there's somebody who's doesn't have joint discomfort or anything like that, they feel good, but their performance is starting to come down. Often I'll just reduce set volume and leave everything else pretty much the same. So we're still getting, from the secondary emphasis of maintaining fitness, we're still getting a training stimulus. We're still getting high threshold motor unit recruitment by keeping relative effort fairly high. I might drop it from like an 8 RPE to a 7, but I'm not dramatically, it's not a light week in terms of relative effort. So I keep relative effort reasonably high and I dial back volume. Whereas for a strength athlete, I may dial back, since they're already using fairly heavy loads in many cases, I may dial back relative effort a bit more. And the other thing with depending on the nature of what contributes to it, I may increase the rep range. So say I had somebody doing like 4 sets of 5 to 8 on like squats. I may, and their knees are starting to bother them, and they're a bodybuilder, definitely emphasizing hypertrophy. I may go from 4 sets of 5 to 8 to 2 sets of like 8 to 12, but keeping relative effort similar. So it's a lower stimulus. It should reduce fatigue to a decent degree. I try not to like choose opposite ends of the spectrum for rep ranges because I don't want it to be like a completely novel stimulus. Like, okay, now you're doing sets of 15 to 20, getting wrecked from 2 sets. But like I think just that subtle shift, going from 5 to 8 to 8 to 12 or something like that, it gives they're able to train a little bit lighter. They're doing less sets, but they're still maintaining adaptations because their relative effort is still reasonably high. And so like there hasn't been research to really indicate that that's the best way to do it. But I think based off of what we know, it makes sense from a mechanistic standpoint. But during deloads, I try to just get a feel for what the athlete is, what's causing their fatigue. I mean, you have a lot of people that it's like if they just feel run into the ground and they just feel like the block has just grinded them into a paste, which hopefully you get to them before that occurs. But oftentimes the message of maintaining intensity, I think some people take that a little too literally. And there's times where you need to dial back intensity just from the psychological perspective. Like people just don't want to get under a heavy load for within a specific week, which can also be worked around with a slightly higher rep range, like I would approach if it was a connective tissue thing that we were trying to work around. So I think, the same trend of reduction in volume, maintain intensity, unless there's situations where that's not advisable. And there are going to be some of those. So it's a pliable approach and very context specific.
Excellent. In that example of the lifter who got absolutely wrecked by his training block, and you might have to manipulate a couple more variables than you typically would during the deload, do you think there might be an advantage for that specific case of just taking extra days off?
Yeah, I think, with the idea of reducing, fatigue is the main priority. Yeah, that makes sense, because we know you're likely going to still end up ahead, even if you take time off. Like a good example of this, which, I mean, this still applies to bodybuilding, same concepts, but did you ever run Smolov, the squat cycle in your power?
No.
So, I mean, Smolov it's just like a gauntlet of high frequency, high volume squat training, or you can do it with bench too. But you train 4 days a week, and I think it's like 4x9, 5x7, 6x5, and then like 8x3 or something. It's just like you start adding sets as the reps come down. So it's grueling. But basically, at the end of this, if you survive it, I'm not advocating anybody does this. And I think Alberto Nunez has the best way of describing Smolov. He said it's like the crash diet for strength athletes.
That's a great way of putting
Like
it.
I'm going on a cruise and I need to squat 400, so I'm gonna run Smolov. But at the end of that, you're instructed to just take a week off. And knowing what I know now, because I've run it probably 2 or 3 times, and fortunately I wasn't injured when I did it. I would never do it again. But knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't take a full week off. But even taking that full week off, you still, people still see these radical increases in performance in many cases, or very substantial increases. Like their squat may go up 25, 30 pounds. And I mean, that's significant for, really any person that should be, would be entertaining the thought of doing that. But so I do think we know fatigue dissipates faster than fitness. That's illustrated in that example. Of doing is you sort of lose some of that on the back end. Like you can't, like even a normal intro week after taking a full week off could, like, it still beats you up pretty good, So I think you make the next block, the beginning of it, a little bit less efficient, because you have to work your way back up to the volume. Like if you just jumped back into the volume you normally do after a week off, or like a normal intro week, then you would probably still be pretty beat up and have quite a bit of muscle damage. So I think keeping some work in there is advantageous for just the repeated bout effect, just helping make, ensuring that you're not going to bury yourself at the start of the next block, but also for, maintaining adaptations to an even larger degree. But there's definitely cases where, I'll tell somebody to take more time off if they're run down. And I think we look at it from a physiological component for muscle, or aspect for muscle growth, but the psychological element is just as important across a full training career. And so you want people to be, eager most of the time to get in and train. And if more time off is required to do that, then I mean, it's not something I'm afraid to do.
Excellent. So transitioning into the next topic for our theoretical macrocycle we have here, should we dedicate an entire block of training towards a metabolite focus? Is there any unique benefit to this pathway for hypertrophy, or is it really just a backdoor to mechanical tension and to achieve the same effect we could with a heavier weight, but just through utilizing a lighter one?
That's a great question, and as it stands right now, I think it's primarily just a backdoor to mechanical tension, and I don't think anybody, I mean, even proponents of the metabolite phases, I don't think anybody would dispute that mechanical tension is the primary driver or primary mechanism for hypertrophy. But we don't know definitively. And we talked about Schoenfeld and some of the research he was doing looking at that I think he's collaborating with Mike Isertel on with the block structure, which will be super interesting. But I believe they're also working on some research that's trying to tease this out a little bit more. And it's a tough thing from a study design perspective, and I'm no expert in that area at all, but I know it's hard to get metabolic stress without mechanical tension alongside it. And I believe there was one study, and I definitely don't remember the name of the author on this one, but they used BFR. I think they did traditional training, and then they applied BFR like after a set, and basically to increase metabolic stress within the muscle, like after they had performed regular straight sets. And the hope being that it would, you would get the mechanical tension from the training and then the metabolic stress from the BFR. And so this was just blood flow restriction without reps performed. And it didn't offer any additive benefit. But I think that's, to my knowledge, the only research that's tried to, like, the closest thing we have to isolating it, and I could be wrong there, but point being, as of now, I don't think it's clear that metabolite training in and of itself deserves a dedicated block specifically for that reason. Now, kind of going back to the theme of all of this, I think there's certainly a role within an overall program to do this, whether it be just load management on the joints, enjoyment. I mean, I know even as like overall, the majority of the time I enjoy training, fairly heavy. Like, from being a power lifter, I would much rather do, sets of 4 to 6 than sets of 8 to 12, So, even with that being said, there are times where I don't want to, like, I think a metabolite phase, like, if any, it's not going to hurt anything. We know that. Like, we know that, rep ranges, I mean, hypertrophy is not intensity specific. And so if we know it's not going to hurt anything, and this kind of goes into the periodization discussion, it's like, what harm is there in actually doing it? Like, you would almost have to try to avoid, like, in order to really be non-periodized, as it's defined in the literature, of just changing no variable, like you just do 3 times 3 by 10 RM, that as adaptations occur, I mean, you would be lifting more weight, but it would still be, the training variables would still be the same in terms of relative effort, sets, reps. But you would have to go out of your way to actually program something like that, like, so you're going to have a periodized program at the end of the day in most cases. And I think, I don't know, I guess I'm not super, like, passionate about the argument of periodization for hypertrophy because of that reason. I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the mechanisms of all of this and sort of lose sight of the practicality that some of this provides. And I think that's a good example. It's kind of like looking at protein intake after, the anabolic window, and, people arguing over whether or not, it's necessary to get protein in, within 2 hours after training. And people, argue about this stuff, and it's like, well, who's not going to eat within 2 hours after training? Like, most, like, you would have to, like, most people do that already. You're like, what if there was a 10% chance that, having a shake within 45 minutes was more beneficial, and I know I'm going to probably end up doing that anyway at some point, it's like, is it really that much effort to try to, like, something doesn't need to be proven to implement it, especially if it's not going to set you back. So a lot of these things sort of fall back into that way of thinking for me is like, if it's not going to hurt anything and there's other benefits that can be observed outside of, mechanisms for, anabolism, then like, why not implement some of those? So that being said, I was watching a podcast. It was actually Steve Hall's podcast he did with Brad Schoenfeld, I think at the end of last year. And he had asked him about the metabolite phase. And one thing he had brought up that I hadn't thought of, we had talked about, does heavy weight help you more in moderate rep ranges? Like, yeah, it's gonna, if you're stronger, like if you increase your 1RM, chances are your set of 12 is going to see some type of increase, or your set of 10. Is it going to be as much if you focused on sets of 10? Probably not, but you're still going to see some residual downstream effect just from being stronger in general. Well, in this case, when you're going from, a metabolite phase back to a, more moderate rep range, Brad had mentioned the potential benefit of like the increased buffering capacity that you can have, training in those higher rep ranges that are still like that system and that demand is still going to be there in moderate rep ranges. So, training with sets of 15 to 20 may help you in your sets of 10 for that reason. And that's something I hadn't, admittedly thought of previously, but makes a lot of sense. I think, it's not going to help your 1 rep max most likely, but, I think when you're looking at sort of neighboring ranges like, 8 to 12 versus 15 to 20, yeah, the 15 to 20 could help you in that 8 to 12 range a little bit. So I think there could be benefits to that. But I'm not sold it's necessary to optimize hypertrophy from like a mechanistic standpoint, from an anabolism standpoint. But again, as emerging information comes out, I very well may change my mind on that. So we'll see.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it kind of seems like the general theme here when it comes to constructing a sort of model to improve hypertrophy outcomes, like there's probably no decrement to implementing any of these things. A low volume strength phase, a metabolite phase, probably not going to hurt you, but it's probably also not going to provide any significant benefit either, at least physiologically. But there, could be a psychological role where it improves your ability to consistently train in the long term because you find these different training approaches very stimulating as compared to keeping things more or less the same for just months on end, where maybe, you're not as excited to get into the gym, which could just simply affect your performance.
Exactly. No, and I think that's the psychological element across a training career is huge, and it doesn't get enough attention and priority in terms of how we structure things, and I think it should. But yeah.
Absolutely. So bringing things down to a more to a closer level, looking at the microcycle as opposed to on a broader scale. When we look at programming strategies to induce progressive overload, whether that be from session to session or week to week, you recently wrote an article about utilizing a method called dynamic double progression and how this could be particularly beneficial for applying overload in the short term. Could you kind of outline what that is for us?
Yeah. It's essentially just double progression, and people have been doing this. I think people sometimes didn't realize or don't realize that this is what they're doing. Like in a lot of research studies, this is what they're doing. Like if they're training 3 by 10 RM, it's like they're adjusting loads as they start to exceed 10 reps. So they're increasing load as a means to stay within a rep range. So that's all it is. Like it's double progression where you're progressing reps before load. in most cases. So, traditional double progression is static in nature. It's pre-planned where, say you're doing 3 sets of 8 to 10. The first week you do 3 sets of 8 with 100 pounds. The next week you do 3 sets of 9 with 100, 3 sets of 10. Then you would rinse and repeat, but increase the weight. So, the problem with any static model like this is it's progressing the stimulus not based off of the rate that you're adapting. It's like having a model that's progressing the stimulus based off the rate of adaptation helps probably control fatigue a little bit better. I think the argument can certainly be made there, but also it allows you to take advantage of your preparedness on days you feel good, which is one of the benefits I think people forget about with auto-regulatory approaches. It's not just to hold you back to manage fatigue. Like there's days where if you're feeling good, you can push it, and so what auto-regulated or dynamic double progression, which I sort of named it in jest because there's all these acronyms out there. But no, it's basically double progression where you're working within a rep range. So that 3 sets of 8 to 10, you would still do, but you're maintaining relative effort set to set. So let's say like a traditional double progression model, your first 3 sets of, your first set of 8 might be at a 6 RPE. Your next set of 8 might be at a 6.5, and then you might end at like a 7 or a 7.5. So relative effort is not static there, like it's not controlled. So with this model, you're maintaining relative effort set to set. So you're doing like you don't know how many reps you're performing until you get there. So you're chasing. Like when I explain this to people, I say, don't chase the rep number, just chase the relative effort that we're after, and then adjust the protocol based off of what you get. So, that 3 sets of 8 to 12, say the first set, you get 3 sets of 10 with 2 reps in reserve. And so we're trying to maintain 2 RIR the entire time. Then the next, say you rest for 4 minutes or so, you come back, you might do 3 sets of 9 with 2 reps in reserve, and then 3 sets of 8 with 2 reps in reserve. So generally, if you're maintaining relative effort and you're not resting like some exorbitant amount of time, you're going to see, in most cases, you're going to see reps like with fatigue start to come down a little bit. But with this model, the way you progress it is, for any set you hit the top end of the rep range in, you would increase load for that set the following week. So if you got 10 reps with 100 pounds on, for the first set on week 1, you might do 10 reps with 105, or you'd load 105 and then perform that up to 2 IR the next week. And so you would manage each set individually. But one thing that's worth mentioning with this is there are times where, and this is a good example of where you're taking advantage of the fact that you're adapting well. You would say we did that 3 sets of 10, or you got 10 reps on the first set with 100 pounds. Then the next week you went up to 105, but let's say you got 10 reps again at the same relative effort. Well, I know that I'm going to be able to still, if the same relationship holds true this week as it did last week, I could probably still keep the load the same for the subsequent sets and stay within the rep range. So I'll often do that is, if I hit the top end of the rep range again, or I know, with the given weight that's on the bar, if I do another set, will I maintain this rep range? If the answer is yes, then I'll usually just keep the weight the same, just because it just avoids the hassle of having to change it. And, it's going to be more conducive to strength anyway. But the premise is once you, especially for that first set, once you hit the top end of the rep range, you increase load. And then the next week, you know where you're starting the protocol, you know what you're loading on the bar. And if say your preparedness is really low and you have that 105 pounds on and you go in and you only get 6 reps at a 2 RIR, then you'd probably want to dial back for that day, and you can either work your way back up or revisit it the next session. But the ultimate goal of this is to keep effort consistent set to set. And I think that's an easier way to start managing volume too, because you're actually comparing apples to apples in that case. You're not, one set isn't at 4 IR, and the next, you're treating it the same as one that's 2 IR. So I like the predictability of it in terms of planning, but also it just seems like it makes a lot of sense from a standpoint of just doing what you're capable of doing within your current level of preparedness, and progressing the stimulus. It's like you're earning your increases essentially. You're not just loading the bar because the Excel sheet tells you to.
Awesome. Yeah, this is something as a real practical example I utilized today. So, last session for curls, 3 sets, I hit 18 reps on set 1, 15 reps on set 2, 13 on set 3. For this session, bumped up the load by 5 pounds for set 1, and I kept the load the same for sets 2 and 3, and then just tried to increase reps from the prior week on sets 2 and 3, and took advantage of that performance to increase load set 1.
Exactly. And there's times where it takes a little bit of a different mentality when you switch to this, if you do this, because you're not necessarily trying to do more reps sometimes. It's just like if the reps are there, like progression occurs organically in this case, based off of how you're adapting. And so in order to make it work, as well as you could, or as well as you can for you, you have to kind of get out of the mentality of chasing a rep number. And I'm not saying you specifically, but just people in general need to start chasing effort. And that's one thing, like I have a velocity device, Speed for Lifts. It's a Spanish company. They've actually just changed their name to the Truve, I think. But anyway, it's a velocity based training device, the cord that attaches to the bar. But what's really cool about this is, I know approximately for squats, for example, the average velocity that corresponds with my, with 3 reps in reserve generally. And so I can set it so I can just perform, the reps as explosively as possible. And it'll tell me once I drop below that velocity. It'll alert me. And so it'll read out the velocities as it goes. And what it's been kind of a cool way to illustrate this concept of, the emphasis is no longer on counting reps and getting through the set, okay, only 3 reps left. It's okay, I'm going to fend off this alarm from going off as long as I can, and fend off this drop in velocity as long as I can. And it's resulted in significantly better performance for me, because it's added that, talk about the psychological side of things, it's added that gaming element within the session. I can focus on the logbook, but it's with velocity and not absolute reps or load. So that's been a fun way to really use this model lately for me. I mean, it's by no means required, but I just bring it up because it's a good way to just focus on execution instead of counting reps. And then once you've achieved sufficient fatigue and you're within the proximity to failure that you're supposed to be in, then you stop the set at that point. So, and oftentimes that's you end up doing more reps than you would have otherwise in the process. So yeah, that's been kind of a cool way to implement it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really, really like that example. And like you said, it's really important to let this progress happen organically. And yes, you should be keeping a logbook. Yes, you should be trying to beat those numbers. But, we see time and time again with people who get too focused on the numbers that, they're adding 5 pounds each week, they're adding a rep each week. Oh, but the range of motion's also going down
Yeah.
by an inch each week.
Yeah.
So really, is there progress going on there? It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
So we kind of touched on, as far as programming goes, it's likely a good idea that if you're doing the same lift, more than once per week, kind of varying that repetition range. We talked about the utility of decreasing RIR, increasing RP over the course from week to week, and whether that's really progressive overload. We have this great dynamic double progression model. Are there any other programming strategies that you tend to like utilizing for hypertrophy? I don't know, maybe anything like a top set for certain lifts, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of tools that I still implement. Like top sets can be advantageous, like create a potentiating effect for back off work. I think those are useful. I've noticed in my own training, like sometimes depending on the amount of time people have available to train, sometimes that adds more time than maybe you get out of it, in terms of benefit. Because you're loading more weight, and then I try to minimize like the number crunching that people have to do when they're training when possible. But top sets are beneficial, especially like I might have, I have a lot of people that are interested in both powerlifting and bodybuilding, like a lot of people that compete in both that I've worked with. And so, top sets are a great way to kind of pull off the dual athlete thing. It's you're able to maintain, high intensity proficiency, with like a conservative single or a, double at an 8, that once or twice a week for a lift, and your back off work is then, pretty submaximal. And so, I mean, that goes into a different topic that I'm interested in is, how much high intensity work do we really need to reap the full benefits of that in terms of like the strength specific adaptations or the high intensity specific adaptations. But top sets, yes, like I'll do a lot of like rest pause work for isolation stuff. And it's essentially like the concept of myo reps, but instead of having a set number of reps for clusters, I might do like, an activation set of at least 15 reps, take it up to, 1 RIR, then, rest 20 seconds, and then go up to 1 RIR again. And so again, it's keeping relative effort static. So you might see like 18 reps, 9 reps, 6 reps, 3 reps, and that might be, the end of it. So, usually I'll reserve that for isolation work. And I think for the most part, isolation work, I'll program high, with a lower RIR anyway, most of the time, because it's not as systemically fatiguing, which I think is probably the bigger issue with higher RPEs for things like squats. But so I'll do that. Let's see what else. Occasionally I'll do drop sets. Like a lot of this is preferences of the athlete too. I mean, we know, especially with hypertrophy, like the canvas to work with is huge. We have so many ways we can achieve the same outcome and reach the same destination. And so catering to someone's preferences is pretty important here. So if they like, if they enjoy BFR, I'll use BFR for a lot of isolation stuff. Even sometimes on like compound lifts, if it's, depending on the situation. But yeah, I've used there's a time and a place for pretty much any technique that's out there when it comes to hypertrophy. But yeah, those are the main things I'll use. Like I use that auto-regulated double progression quite a bit for hypertrophy focused programs. And even sometimes in strength movements, depending on how well the person can gauge RPE. Then clusters. And I know you had talked about at one point in this that you sent this outline you had sent over the central fatigue element of things. And so, keeping the higher volume, high proximity to failure stuff kind of towards the end of the session and with isolation work, I think is going to be more beneficial. But I think some people have, I get the impression some people hear what I am saying and assume, I'm against using chasing the logbook or chasing numbers. And I'm not against that idea. I think there's a lot of enjoyment that comes with that. I mean, I use some of my most fond memories training or when I was doing dog crap training. I don't know if you've ever done that, but trying to beat the logbook. And granted, I was by the end of it, as you alluded to, I was contorting my body every which way to try to bullshit my way that I'm making, progress. But it was fun. And I think there's something to be said for that. But also, I think so long as you can keep technique intact, there is a benefit of training to failure occasionally. And, not necessarily from a muscle growth standpoint, but just knowing what you're capable of doing. And this is something I've kind of noticed with this, more people having access to evidence-based information is a lot of people, I was never told to leave reps in the tank when I first started training. And so I feel like there's a lot of, novice and intermediates that don't really, their 3 RIR is really like a 6 RIR, And so I think there's benefit of training to failure and sort of learning what there's absolutely benefit of knowing what that feels like. So you have to know what failure feels like to know when you're approaching it, And I mean, that your ability to tolerate that and grind through things is going to get a little bit better as you progress across a career. So I think, reminding yourself of where that line in the sand is occasionally can be beneficial. So, at the end of a block, sometimes I'll do plus sets or AMRAPs. And, I used to use more than I do now, but auto-regulatory, what's it called? Progressive resistance exercise, where with powerlifters generally, you dictate the loads based off of a plus set from the prior week. And there's pros and cons to that approach. I mean, I think you're sort of hinging your loading based off of one set. And oftentimes people get really fired up for that one set, and then you end up assigning loads that are pretty assertive, come Monday when they load the bar and they're like, I don't want to do this at all right now. So, but I think just knowing how to work hard, that's something that I do think a lot of younger trainees that don't have that experience. I said this on a different podcast. I forget which one, but I'm glad I was sort of born into the training process with sort of a bro mentality, or with being taught that way, because it taught me the value of hard work and knowing where my actual capacity lies. And I'm a lot better now, being confident when I'm leaving reps in the tank that I'm actually close to where I want to be. And I mean, I think as any coach that's programmed RPE or RIR for their athletes, I mean, they've come across situations where the individual is like, I don't know how to tell between a 2 and a 3. And you look at their set and you're like, well, you're not either. You're at based on velocity, you're at a 6, So, so yeah, and I think there's a study, they reviewed it in Mass, that looked at these college age athletes. I think they had like 6 months of resistance training experience, but they asked them, how much do you bench for sets of 10? And then they took them into the lab and actually loaded that weight and pushed them, motivated them and to true failure. And I think on average, people were leaving it was like 6 reps in reserve on average. With some people, it was like 10 or more reps in reserve based off of what they actually got. And so a lot of people just aren't training hard enough to begin with. And so that mentality of chasing the logbook, it's like, for most of the population, is that really that detrimental? Like, I don't know if it is. For an advanced athlete, I think it can be. Somebody who really knows how to push close to failure, I think it can really kind of grind them into a paste after a while. But I'll still use that approach with some novice athletes, is try to do more reps than you did last time with good technique. And more often than not, adaptation has occurred to accommodate that anyway. It's just getting them into the mentality of leveraging that. So hope that made sense.
Fantastic insight. We could very easily extend this conversation for another 2 hours, but I've already taken up too much of your time, Brian, and I'm extremely grateful for how generous you have been with us. To wrap things up, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram at BDMiner. I'm not super active on social media. I should be more, but that's the best place to reach me. And then my website, myojournal.com. But if anyone's interested in coaching or consults or anything, you can find that information out there.
Cool. So we definitely dove into the think tank today. I really appreciate these nuanced conversations. A lot of it is theory and speculation, but for me, I think these are the most fun conversations.
Yeah, there's still so much shit we don't know.
Yeah.
You just kind of have to go with what works in practice. So I think at the end of the day, anecdote is pretty valuable.
For sure. All right, everyone. That's another episode for the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. If you liked this episode, leave us a review. We are available on Spotify, Stitcher Radio, Apple Podcasts, and of course, you can find the video content on YouTube. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.